Hello, good people, and welcome to Finance Skills Hub. Here, we learn, we connect, and we grow. In this video, we want to learn how to build an interactive inventory tracker dashboard that takes into consideration the calculation of cost of goods sold using the first in, first out principle. An example we are going to use here is for multiple products. Now, when we buy different products to sell at different times and at different prices, it is important that in calculating the cost of the goods sold, we account for the items that came in first. And that is what we are going to learn in this video. We'll learn how to use Excel's Power Pivot to create a data model so that we can get that interactive dashboard that can update and refresh when our data sources expand. So as we always do, we'll share the start file with you so you can come along and practice and build your own dashboard at your own pace. So if you're game, join me in Excel and let's get started. So before we begin, let's have a quick walkthrough of the final dashboard. This is a very simple inventory tracker dashboard. It tells us the revenue, the cost of goods sold. Now, this is the key calculation in this dashboard. When we bring in items, we want to sell the ones that came in early, value it, and then assign the cost of goods sold before we value subsequent items. So this calculation takes care of the first in, first out model when you are dealing with different items. We'll get into that later. Then we have our profit. It also shows us the quantity remaining. Then we now are able to compare quantity sold and quantity purchased in terms of quantity, fraction on the left, and then the trend on the right. So of course, you can have a slicer that breaks down all these calculations, right? So as I mentioned earlier, the heart of this is the calculation of the cost of goods sold. Now, when we come to the purchases table, this is the purchases table. Okay, so it records every item that we bring in. So we sell 3 different items, which is logged in here. So we have mango, orange, and banana. This has a unique list of all the products that we sell. Now, when you bring in items, you record the date, the item, and then the quantity you purchased and the unit price, right? So all the blue numbers are inputs, and then black numbers are calculations. Now, as I mentioned, if we want to assign cost of goods sold, we want to first sell the first batch of mangoes that was purchased at 2 cedis 50 pesos. There were 43 of these. So if we sell the first 43, we expect the units remaining for this line to go to 0. Okay. Then the next batch that we sell will now come to the next 12 that we brought in. Okay. So currently we've sold the 43, we've sold the 12, and then we are currently selling the next batch, which was 50. Now, out of that, we've sold 38 and we are left with 12. Now, to show you how this works, so let's say we go in and we sell 13. Okay, so what is going to happen is the 12 that you see here is going to be wiped away. Then the next batch of mangoes, which is another 50, bought on the 12 March, okay, is going to reduce by 1. Now let's see how this works. So I'll come to the sales table, come in here, and then introduce that new mango. Okay, so, and I sell 13, okay, at 4 cedis. Now you notice that the calculations are updated here. So if I come to my purchases, you realize that the 12 that I had here has now been wiped away, and the next batch is now counting. Okay, out of that we've sold 1, we have 49 remaining. So aside getting the units remaining, we can now calculate the cost of goods sold. Okay, so this is now going to be calculated on the units that have been sold. Okay, so in this case, we have our 4 cedis for that 1 that we sold from this current batch. Then we can now do our aggregations and then get this final dashboard, right? So this is very important for those who do first in, first out valuation. especially when it comes to cost of goods sold. So that is the overview. Let's get into it and see how we created this right from scratch. So we'll begin with this start workbook. This has been shared with you. So we have the layout for the dashboard, which are basic shapes in a gray background. Then we have the data for purchases. So we start off with the first 4 months of the year to make it easier for you to understand. So as I mentioned, the entries colored in blue are things that you put in. Okay, so you can put in the purchase date, the item that you bought, the quantity purchased, and the unit price. On the right, okay, is your list of products. These are the unique products that you sell, right? So again, this is an input. You can extend and add new products that you bring in. Then we also have our sales table. So after we've brought in the items, we now start selling, right? So we can sell different items, different quantity, and then we can sell them at different prices, okay? So this is the sales table, right? Now, to make everything that we are going to do dynamic, it is important that we convert all these into a table. Tables allow us to store them in a structured way so that when the data expands or shrinks, we don't have to recalculate our formulas. It just updates on refresh, okay? So first, let's convert these 3 data sets into a table. So to do that, you stand anywhere in this range and you press Ctrl T, or you go to insert and you insert a table right from here. Okay, so I confirm that my table has headers and I'm going to click OK. So this table comes in with table design. The table name here, I'm going to call this purchases. So we'll repeat the same thing for our register. So I'll stand here, Ctrl T, ensure your table has headers is checked, and then you click OK. So this is going to be my register. And then we go into the sales table and then convert this one also into a table. We call this sales. Okay, so we have 3 tables that we are going to work with. Now, let's go and do the calculations. So I have my purchase date, item, quantity purchased, and unit price. First, I want to know the cost of the items that I purchased. So this is going to be a simple multiplication. I take the first one, quantity purchased, and then multiply by the unit price. This is how much it cost me overall to bring in these items, right? So with tables, I can get a direct fill for all the calculations in the column, right? So I have my cost of quantity purchased. Now for units sold, I basically have to sum all the mango that has been sold, okay, in the sales table, right? And then when I'm done, I'll calculate the units remaining, okay? So to do this calculation, there are 3 key things that we need to consider. The first one is to sum all the mango that has been sold in the sales table. But you need to realize that for this, every mango record is different. So if I do a sum ifs, what's going to happen is that it's going to sum every mango that has been sold in the sales table. So let's first do that calculation. So here I'm going to do sum ifs. Okay, I like using the one with the S. Okay, so sum ifs, my sum range is the quantity. So I'll call the sales table. Okay, this advantage of using tables, you can call the table without going directly to mouse over. So I'll call the sales table. Then here I'll put in the quantity sold. That's what I'm summing. Okay, the criteria, the basis for summing is the item, which contains mango, orange, and banana. So I'll call the sales table again, and this time I'll call item. Okay, then the criteria for summing this is this mango. Okay, so this is going to be my core formula, summing what has been sold in the sales table. I'll close this. So this tells me that I've sold 103. Okay. Now, the units sold for this particular line should not exceed 43. Okay. So I cannot record anything more than 43 here. I'm going to introduce a main function, right, which will compare the quantity I purchased against how much has been sold. So as I mentioned, every item you bring in will be treated as a unique record, even if it is the same item that you are recording, right? So to compare, I'm going to step right after the equal sign, introduce min, and then compare this quantity purchased, okay, bring a comma, against the earlier calculation. So if we sold in excess of what we actually brought in, then this is going to show that we have sold 43, right? So that is our first calculation. Now, let's copy this down. Now, if I copy this down, you will notice that it shows 43 for the first mango, okay? It shows 12 for the second one, and so on, right? But these will not be correct because we've sold 103. We expect the remainder to be deducted from the second batch of mangoes, the third batch, and so on. Okay. So what we are going to do is going down, this formula is now going to take into consideration if we have sold mango earlier, okay, and then subtract it from this calculation. Okay, so this is where it takes care of the first in, first out. So we are going to modify this formula to consider whether the item in question has been sold in an earlier record. Okay, so we will go and then bring in another sum if. So that sum if is basically going to, so again, I'm using the sum ifs with the S. So for our sum range, we want to reference this column. Okay, now when we reference it, we have to reference it in such a way that the range expands, okay, as we go down. So if I am in the first row, I'm only summing what is above me. If I am in the fourth row, I am summing row 1 to 3. Okay, so we need a range that expands as we go down. Now, to be able to do that, I will have to select the first cell here, which is currently reading the structured labels for the table. So you see purchases headers, quite a complex name here. We don't want the table name to show up every time we select a part of the table. We just want the direct cell reference. So instead of using the table names, what we are basically going to do is we want to deactivate the feature of the table that shows us the table names when we reference. And we can do that. So we can go to File. Okay. Then we come to Options. Formulas. Okay. Now here you have the option to deactivate Use Table Names in Formulas. So I'm going to uncheck this and then click OK. Okay. So if I come here now, I can now put in my sum ifs to take care of the records that we've sold earlier. So I will now come and then introduce my sum ifs. Okay. So basically the criteria range is going to be what is above my current position, which is G3. Now I want to select G3 to G3. So I'll put in a colon. Okay. So the column will repeat the cell reference. Now I want to anchor the first part, lock the row in the first cell, which is G3. So my cursor is currently between G and 3. I'm going to put in a $sign in front of 3. Okay. So this is my sum range. As you copy this down, this is going to be expanding. So G3, G4, G3, G5, and so on. Then I'll bring a comma. For my criteria range, I'm going to select the item. Okay. So I'll select this. The same way, I'll bring a colon, stand between C and 3 in the first reference, and then put in a $sign. Okay. So this completes my criteria range. I'll bring a comma. Now to the criteria itself, that is what I'm using as basis. We'll step down one cell and then select C4. Okay, so this, we are going to allow it to be relative. Okay, relative means it goes down with us without locking. Right, so this is going to be our range. So our sum range, our item, and the relative criteria. Okay, so I'll go ahead, I'll close this, and then I'll close my final brackets. Now let's see what this gives us. So I expect 43 here. I'll take this one and then copy it down. Now you notice that our formula is working. So the 103 that we sold for mangoes is going to go off this 43. Okay, it's going to go off this 12. It's going to go off this 10. Then in the fourth batch that we have, it starts counting from the 50. Okay, so we've sold 38 of that. Okay, now you notice that for the subsequent mango entries, we now have 0 because it's not their turn yet. Okay, so this is the key formula that is going to help us assign the first in, first out principle to the calculation of our cost of goods sold. So now that we have this out of the way, we can now proceed and calculate the units remaining. So for the units remaining is how much I brought in, quantity purchased, minus the units that I have sold. Okay, so this is going to give me 0. Okay, so it calculates correctly for the rest. Now for the cost of goods sold, this is where we assign how much it cost us for the items that we have sold. So I will take the unit sold and multiply it by the unit price, which in some cases, in some markets, is variable. So that is why this is important. So I'll take this and then I'll copy this down. Okay. So this is the cost of goods sold. Then for my inventory value, okay, it is how much is remaining, okay, multiplied by the unit price. Okay, so again, I'm going to copy this down. So this is what we have. This is going to form the basis for all the key metrics that you saw in the dashboard. So now that we are done with this, let's now go and do the calculations for our dashboard. Okay, so now that we are done with our calculation, a very important note here is because of the way we created this formula, okay, we expect this to expand smoothly when we are making a new entry. Okay, so this is a table. So to make it easier for the formula to expand, what you need to do when you are adding a new record is to come to the last cell in the last row. Okay, so I'm currently standing in here, 52.5. Now to release the next row or the empty row, you just press the tab key. Okay, so when you press the tab key, it ensures that the formula that you did copies down smoothly, okay, and you are able to bring in the new item so that it takes the calculation to the right without any circular reference. So now that this is out of the way, what we need to do now is to create our aggregations, right? So our aggregations here is going to give us the total revenue, the total cost of goods sold, profit, quantity remaining, and so on. We want the 3 tables that we created to sit in a data model in Excel so that we can create simple DAX calculations from there, create pivot tables, and then from the pivot tables, we create the aggregations. That way, it is dynamic. When new records come in, you just refresh and you get your latest numbers. So we are going into Power Pivot. So Power Pivot is in Excel 2016 or later. If you don't have it, you have to activate it for the first time. So you come to Data, okay, and in the Data Tools group, you see this data model icon. You click on it the first time, it opens the Power Pivot window. You can close it. When you come back, you see Power Pivot has been enabled. Right. So if Power Pivot has been enabled, we are now going to load these 3 tables into the data model. So what you need to do is you stand in the first table, then you see under Power Pivot the option to add this table to the data model, right? So I'll stand in here and then I'll click add to the data model. So you notice that my first table has registered here. I'll close the Power Pivot window, then go and add the register. So I'll click add to the data model. I'll close this, and then finally I'll load my sales table. So I'll add this to the data model as well. Right, so we now have our three tables. I'm currently in the data view. If I come to the diagram view, you see these three tables represented with boxes to make it easier for you to connect and then create what we call the data model. Right. Now, the tables that have activity that are very fluid is the table that records our purchases and the table we sell from. These we can create our measurements. So we call these the fact tables. We normally place these down, and then the table here, which we are going to use to break down or create our slicer from, is the dimension table, giving us perspective on each product, right? So in our calculation, we will break down with a register, but we'll also break down with month, okay, which is going to help us see the trend of our quantity sold and quantity purchased. Now, between these two tables, indeed, there are date columns, but we want one harmonized date column that can control these two date columns we have in purchases and sales. So in Power Pivot, you have the option to bring in a dedicated date table that will scan the earliest date and the latest date in both tables and create a timeline. So to do that, I'll come to design, okay, in the Power Pivot, and then you have the option to create a date table here. So I'll go to new, okay. So this is going to create the calendar table, which has all our date attributes in here, right? So we now have two dimension tables and then two fact tables. Now we need to connect the common columns, okay? So for register, this one has the items that we are selling, the unique list. This is going to be matched with item, right? So I'll select item here, click and hold it, and then connect it to this register, right? So I've created a one-to-many, means this can break down this table, okay? I'll do the same thing for sales. So I'll select item here and then drag it all the way and then connect it here. So again, I have a one-to-many. For the relationship between the calendar and the purchases table, we are going to use the purchase date and this date, right? Now, ideally, you should select the date from the fact table first, okay, and then you drag it up, right? I've noticed that it's a bit more consistent that way. So we are going to select the foreign key in this case, click and hold it, and then you connect it to the primary key here, right? So this gives us another one-to-many, and then you select the date in the sales as well, and then you connect this to the calendar table. Again, this also gives us a one-to-many, right? So this is the data model that we are going to use for all our aggregations. And then once we are done with this, we can now proceed and then create our DAX calculations, right? So we are going to exit Power Pivot. Okay, we'll close this, and then we now can create, if you like, a calculations sheet. Okay, so I'm going to add a calculation sheet. Now, what we want to do basically is to aggregate our revenue, our cost of goods sold, our profit, right? These are very simple calculations, but we want to create measures so that they update when the table expands, right? So example, for revenue, when we come to the sales table, we are multiplying quantity sold and selling price. Then we aggregate this to get that revenue. When we come to cost of goods sold, we've already calculated it here. So we just sum this column. right? And then we go on like that. So we are now going to create these measures. So to create measures in Excel, we create them in Power Pivot, right? So the Power Pivot tab is here. We'll go to measures and then we'll start a new measure. So for this purpose, all our measures are going to be stored in the purchases table. There are ways to also create a dedicated table for measures, but for this purpose, we store them in the purchases table. Okay, so let's create our first measure and we'll call this revenue. Okay, now if you see the structure of our sales table, we have the quantity sold and then the selling price, right? So we need to multiply these two columns row by row and then we sum. Okay, if you know how sum product works, it's something similar, but in DAX we have a dedicated function called SUMX. Okay, so what SUMX does is an iteration function. You give it the table name, which is sales. Okay, then you put in the expression, and this expression is going to be calculated row by row. So for each record in the sales table, I want to multiply the item, the quantity sold, okay, by the selling price. Right, so this is going to give us the aggregate for our total revenue. So this is the SUMX, sales quantity sold times selling price. You have the option to format this. So I will use 1,000 separator and then 0 decimal place. You can check your formula to be sure everything is correct and you click OK. Okay, so usually how you will know that this has calculated well is to insert a pivot table, okay, from the data model. So I'll insert a pivot table from the data model in this existing worksheet. Now you will notice that when this pops up in the purchases table, there's a new calculation for revenue, okay, which is here. So if I check this, you realize that my revenue is now here, which is 637, right? There's another way to retrieve this with Q formulas, but for this purpose, you can stick to the pivot tables if you are comfortable with that. Okay, so we are going to repeat this process for the rest of the calculation, right? So we'll go to Power Pivot. I'll go to measures. I'll start a new measure. So still in the purchases table, let's call this COGS, COGS. Now, this one is a rather simple one because we already have a column that has calculated cost of goods sold. So I'll do sum, okay, and I'll go to the purchases table and then look for cost of goods sold. I'll close this. I'll repeat the formatting procedure, okay. Check your formula, everything is okay, and then you click OK. So you notice that because I'm standing in the pivot table, this already populates with revenue and cost of goods sold. We'll go ahead and then now calculate for profit. So I'll come to the measure name. I'm going to make this profit. So for profit, because we already have our revenue and our cost of goods sold, we can now call these existing measures. So to call the existing measures, you use a square bracket. So this is revenue minus cost of goods sold. Okay, so check our formula. Again, we'll format this, use 1,000 separator. Then we push this to 0 and we click OK. So this is going to be our first 3 calculations in our dashboard. So 637, 478, and 159. Right. Now, let's now calculate quantity remaining. Again, we have this already calculated in the purchases table. So we just have to go in and sum. So I'll go create a new measure. Right. So we'll call this quantity remaining. Use the abbreviated version of quantity remaining. So for quantity remaining, I'll sum. And I'll come to the purchases table. So I'll come to the purchases table and then I'll look for units remaining. Okay, so I'm going to sum this. check formula, everything is fine. Number, use 1000 separator, and right. So this will now be the calculation for the first 4 indicators in our dashboard. So at this point, let's calculate our last 2 measures, which is going to be quantity sold and the quantity remaining. So I'll come new measure. All right. So we'll make this quantity sold. Again, we find quantity sold in the sales table. So I'm going to go to the sales table, and then I have quantity sold over here, right? So you ensure that the right column is selected. So we'll check our formula. We'll format this. We use 1000 separator, 0 decimal place, and then we click OK. So we have quantity sold as 177. And then finally, let's calculate our quantity purchased. We'll come in here and then we'll do our quantities purchased. So for our quantities purchased, is a sum of the purchases made in the purchases table, right? So this is what we are going to use. So I'll check our formula, come to number, use 1000 separator, and I'll click OK. So if you get an error like this, it's because you have the name in the formula matching the measure name you chose. Okay, so it's 2 things. You have to change one of them. So let's come in here, and then we make this one quantity purchase, a rather long name. So let's check our formula. This is fine now. We set this to 0 decimal place, and then we proceed. Okay. So these are the key formulas or measures. So now that we've calculated this, we just now have to go and then create the pivot tables in such a way that they can feed our final dashboard, right? So that's how we are going to go about this. So the next thing we're going to do is just feed these values into our final dashboard. So congratulations if you have come this far. I'm sure you are learning a lot already. You know that if we create measures, it allows us to get our calculations updated if the data source changes. Now, if you are new to DAX, that's Power Pivot in Excel, Power Query, Cube formulas, and how to combine all these with pivot tables to create dashboards, then I would like to introduce my book, Data Modeling with Microsoft Excel. This is a comprehensive book that dives deep into DAX calculations using Power Pivot in Excel, how to clean data with Power Query, use Cube formulas, put all these together with pivot tables to create interactive dashboards. So the link has been shared with you if you want to get a copy from Amazon. There are hard copies here in Ghana as well, so you can reach out and then get a copy. In the meantime, let's now go ahead and then put all this together in one interactive dashboard. Okay, so we have our final task, which is to populate our dashboard with the calculations. So the dashboard has been laid out for you. As I mentioned, these are rounded corner rectangles. Okay, they've been formatted and filled white. Right, we inserted them as regular shapes from here. Okay, and then for contrast, we just filled the background with a shade of gray. Right. So let's quickly put in our labels. So this is going to be revenue in Ghana cedis. Okay, then next is cost of goods sold, also in Ghana cedis. Then we have our profits in Ghana cedis, and then we have our quantity remaining, okay, which is in units. Then we have our quantity sold versus quantity purchased. Okay, and then finally, for the same thing, we have trend of quantity sold and purchased. Right. Now, when you lay out your captions like this, it's easier if it is centered. right, sitting nicely on the ship. Right. So we want to do this without merging the cell. So what we'll do is that we'll select the range where we want to center. We'll go home, okay, and you can use this font settings icon here that is in the bottom right corner of the font group, okay, or you could also press Ctrl 1. Right, so this brings us to the format cells dialog box. When you choose alignment, you have the option to center this horizontally, right? So in the horizontal menu, you go in there and then you choose center across selection and you click OK, right? So this way you notice that it's well centered, but we don't have to deal with the issues with merge cells, right? The cells are still available. Okay, so you can now put in an underline. Now, after you've done this, you can now select the range and then apply this format to the rest of the headers. So I'm going to double click the format painter, okay, and then select the rest of the captions so that everything is consistent, right? So ensure that you select the range that you want to center to. So this would ensure, so this will now give us our captions well centered, right? Now let's fill in our first indicator. This is a pivot table. So because this is a pivot table, we want to deactivate the get pivot data feature, right? So usually when you come to the pivot table analyze, under options, there is the option to generate get pivot data. If this is active, you see a tick mark here. So deactivate it by clicking, right? If you don't, what this is going to do is that when you reference this cell, it's going to generate a formula which cannot fit into the shape in the dashboard, right? So ensure that this is deactivated. Now that is done, we'll come to the dashboard, select this shape, okay? Click inside the formula bar, put in an equal to here, and then we come to the calculations and then select our revenue and you press enter. So this is going to bring in the revenue. Let's do same for the rest. Then we apply a consistent format to all of it. So I'll select this shape as well, come put in an equal sign, go to the calculations table and then feed the cost of goods sold. Repeat the process for profit, equal to, come to the calculations. So this is profit, quantity remaining, step in here, equal to, calculations, we'll do quantity remaining, which is 206, right? Now let's format the first indicator. So for starters, I want to change the font type to Berlin Sun FB, right? So I'm using Berlin Sun's FB. So I'll middle align and then center align and then increase the font to about 36. Okay. So with this format, I can now apply to these four indicators. So I'll select the shape, the same thing we did, double click, and then you touch this, you touch that, and then you touch that. Makes things easier for you. When you are done, you press the escape key. Okay. So this is going to fill in the first four indicators for us. Now for quantity purchased, we want to create this donut chart, right? We already have the calculation here. So we have quantity sold and quantity purchased. You can use them directly as you have them here. In this context, we are assuming that this pivot table remains static. It's not going to expand downwards or rightwards, right? So ensure that when you're using pivot tables, take into consideration changes in the pivot table that may conflict with other pivot tables. So for quantity purchased, we can create a new pivot table just for quantity sold and quantity purchased, and then we insert a chart on that. So I'll leave some columns, come to insert pivot table from the data model in the same existing worksheet. So here we'll go to the purchases table and look for only quantity sold. So we check for So we'll check quantity sold and then we'll check quantity purchased. Okay, so as long as these two remain in the same pivot table, we can now insert a pivot chart on this. So I'll go ahead and then go to insert while selecting the pivot table, and I'll go and select the pivot chart. Now, when I click on this, you notice that I get two rings. It's because of the layout of the pivot table, right? So if you get something like this, what you need to do is select the chart, come to the design tab and switch the row and column. Okay, so if I do the switch of the row and column, I get it as I showed, right? Quantity sold and quantity purchased. Now, to format this chart, we need to take off what we call the filled buttons, these gray buttons. They are located, it is located under the pivot chart analyze tab. So I'll come here, drop the filled buttons and hide all. Okay, I'll take off my total, and then I can choose to reposition my legend to the left, right? So you select the legend, you press Ctrl 1, and then you push this to the left. Now, if you look at the final work, we have a green color for quantity sold. So I'm going to select just that portion and then fill buckets with green. Okay, and then for this part, we are going to use this shade of gray. Okay, so this now gives us our donut chart. I'm now going to cut this and then bring it and then fit it in my dashboard. Right, so ensure that you are able to align it nicely to the backdrop that you have over there. Okay, while this is selected, you can choose to take off the outline of the chart. Okay, even for the shape fill, you can choose a no fill because we already have a white background. Right, this way it sits in nicely in the background. Okay, so we now have this. Now, if you notice in our final dashboard, we put in the percentage for the quantity sold. Okay, so this we can calculate and then fit this here in a text box. So I'll come to the calculations. Right? So again, because we don't expect this to go down, we can do the calculation at the bottom, but take care that if you have a pivot table that expands, don't put anything under or to the right. Right. So maybe for this purpose, let's come to the right. So this divided by quantity purchased is going to give us the percentage sold. So this is in decimal, Control Shift percentage, or you can use the percentage sign here to format this. So this is going to be the percentage sold. I'm going to feed this into my dashboard. That's the text box. So I'm going to insert a text box here. So gently draw the text box in the middle. Now, while it is selected, we go through the same process. We come into the formula bar, then we come to our calculations, and then we select this. We can now middle and then center align. Right? Choose the same font, which is Berlin Sans FB, and then increase the font a bit. Okay, so while this is selected, the text box, we can take off the shape outline. Right. So we have something like this. We can format the font and then paint it green just to be consistent. So this will now give us the percentage of quantity sold. Right. Now, for our last chart, which is going to be the trend of quantity sold against quantity purchased, just as we did with the earlier chart, we want to create a new pivot table, right? So I'll leave some few columns, come and insert the pivot table from the data model. Okay, then I'll click OK. So for this purpose, we want to compare quantity sold, which we have already calculated. So I'll go and select quantity sold. Then I'll also put in quantity purchased. But we want to break this down by month. And that is why we calculated or we created the calendar table. So I'll come in here. So in the calendar, instead of using the date hierarchy, I'll come to more fields and use the month label here. I'll push this to rows. Okay. Now you notice that it's currently showing for only the active months, right? So if there's no activity, it's not showing. But we want all the 12 months to show, even though we have not sold or purchased in those months, right? We have the option to do that. So select any of the months, right click, then you come to pivot table options. Okay. So while this is active, so when this dialog box pops up, you can go to display, right? Under display, you see show items with no data on rows. Okay. And you click OK. So this is going to ensure that you have all the 12 months displayed in your chart. Now we want to insert our chart. So I'll stand in the pivot table, go to insert, and let's use the recommended chart, which will give us the clustered column chart as the default chart. So this is the chart that we are going to use. Now we want to take off the filled buttons. So we'll hide all and then position our legend at the bottom to create more space. Now you notice that our month labels are struggling to set, right? Because the length of the text for each month is a bit long. So we want to abbreviate this, right? So for learning purposes, let's see how we can do this right in the data model. So we are going to go back to the data model. So we'll go to Power Pivot, come to Manage, right? Now it is the calendar table that has the month labels, particularly this column called month, right? So if you select it, you realize that you have the formula, and in there, there's a format for 4Ms, which displays the full name. So what we need to do is, instead of 4Ms, we are going to back out 1M, okay? And this is going to abbreviate to the short form of the month names. Now, the moment you touch this column, okay, your month arrangement is going to switch to alphabetical order, right? So once you touch this, you ensure that you sort it again, right? Let me just show you how it's going to happen, then we'll come back here. So if I come here, you realize that this is now showing in alphabetical order, April to September, because we touched the default arrangement. So we have to go back and then reorder this chronologically. So I'm going back to the data model. This is where we ended. So I'll select this column and rather sort this column by the month number, right? That's the usefulness of this month number column. So I'll sort by, okay, month number, so that it is now able to sort this chronologically. So once I come back, you notice that my numbers are now sorted chronologically. Right. So in the format, we are going to take off the grid lines, okay? And to be a bit more consistent, we want to make the quantity sold green. So I'll select the bar here, come to home, and then make this green, okay? And then for the quantity purchased, we'll make this gray. Okay, so this is going to be our final chart. While we are here, let's take off the shape outline and then also the shape fill, so it becomes transparent. So I'm going to cut this chart and then bring it to the dashboard and then try and fit it in here. Right, so this is now the trend of quantity sold and then the quantity purchased. Now we need the slicer that is going to interact with all that we've done. Okay, so we want to break all these calculations down by the product that we select. So I'm going to the calculations and then select any of the pivot tables. Okay, go to insert and then we insert a slicer. So when we insert a slicer, it brings us the active table. You can switch to all. Now, what we want to insert a slicer on is the product register table. that one has the unique list of all our products, right? So I'll come to the register, and then I'll select the first column, which is also called register, right? So this is going to give us our slicer. Now notice that this slicer is currently communicating with only this pivot table because I inserted it from here. We want it to communicate with all the pivot tables. So what you do is that once it comes in, you select the slicer, right click, and you see report connections here. This will list all the existing pivot tables. So you check to connect the slicer to all the pivot tables. Okay. So this way, if I click on any of the items here, you'll notice that the pivot tables respond, and our dependent charts in the dashboard would also respond as well. I'm going to cut this, and then I'll come to our dashboard, and then we'll just paste everything here. We'll enable. Okay, so this is going to be my slicer. So for this purpose, we can increase the height of the buttons to use the space a bit. Okay, then you can choose the color that matches your theme. Okay, so this is now going to interact with our final indicators in the dashboard. Right. So in the end, what we've basically done is we've created this inventory tracker, but it's just not showing us the regular indicators. We have been able to use the first in, first out method to correctly value the cost of goods sold here. Right. The way this has been created, all subsequent entries can be made in the sales and purchases table as well as the products table. As I mentioned, if you want the formula for the product for the purchases table to be smooth, your entry should always start at the last cell of data entry. You just put in the tab key and then you put in your details like that. So hopefully you've learned something. So if you have come along up to this point, congratulations. I'm sure you've learned a lot that you can apply to your regular Excel work. Thank you so much for coming along, and we'll see you in the next video.
If this video was helpful and you would like to receive more of these videos directly on your WhatsApp, you can send ad to this WhatsApp number. We'll add you to our broadcast list so you receive our videos directly. You can also visit our YouTube channel, Finance Skills Hub. All our old videos are here. Please subscribe for notification of new videos, or connect with us on any of these social media handles. Thank you so much for watching.